Hi, my name is Jordan Hudgens, and I'm going to walk through how you can build out a fully professional website using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in just 1 hour. In addition to the video, I'm also going to give you access to the source code that I'm going to be using so that you can use it on your own projects. Together, we'll be building this portfolio website. Some of the skills that you're going to learn are going to be HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, Flexbox, CSS Grid, animations, navigation, fonts, and how to use images. Many of the HTML tutorials I've seen focus on teaching the fundamentals first, and those are important. But I've discovered that many students actually learn better by taking a project-based approach. So what we're going to be doing is building out a professional HTML website, and you're going to learn the fundamentals while you're building the project. I'll be following along in the comment section, so if you have any questions or any recommendations or anything like that, please feel free to post those in the comments and I'll get back to you whenever I can. And lastly, if you enjoyed the video and you feel like it helped you on your coding journey, please like the video, subscribe, and I'll be adding more to this channel. So with all that being said, let's dive into the code. So let's go ahead and get started writing code. Now right here I have the finished version of the website that we're going to be building out. And in order to do this, we have just a couple prerequisites. So I'm going to come down to the text editor, and I created a prerequisites file. It's pretty basic. Because HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can all be compiled and can all run inside of the browser, then it doesn't matter what operating system that you're on. I'm on a Windows machine, but for my day-to-day development, I'm usually on a Mac or running Linux. So for what we're building out, you can use any operating system. The only things that you're going to need are a code text editor and then a web browser. So as long as you have these two, and the fact you're watching this right now on YouTube tells me you already have a web browser. So for the text editor, if you do not have one, then I wrote down a list of potential options. My personal favorite is VS Code, and if you want access to that, you can just go to Google and type VS Code download, and it's completely free and it's available in all operating systems. So you can just download it here. So I recommend right now, if you do not have a text editor, to pause the video, come back after you've downloaded that and installed it on your system. So now with all of this in place, let's take a look, because a lot of people can teach you the fundamentals, they can give you step-by-step tutorials. What I want to do though is describe exactly what my workflow is, because anyone can learn syntax. You could go read a book on HTML and CSS and learn the syntax. What I actually want to show you is my own strategy when I'm building the website. So if someone came to me and gave me any kind of website, I would go through this exact process I'm going to show you here. And so hopefully that will help you, because my guess is, as much as you will probably build out some portfolio application in some form or another, the reason why you're going through this is so that you could build out any kind of website and you could implement any design. And so my goal for this video is to show you that process, and then along the way teach you HTML, CSS, and all of those kind of cool tools. So right here, and looking at the finished product, I know I'm going to have to do a few things. So let me start writing this out in list format. So I know I'm going to have to, and I'll say these are my to-dos. First, I'm going to have to build the project. So that is going to entail things such as, creating the folder structure, adding files, connecting files, doing things like that. So that's going to be step one. Then from there, if we take a look back here at the website, if you look at some of the components of this website, you can see at the very top we have a nav bar right here. So that's probably going to be one of the first things I build out. So I'm going to say we want to build the nav bar, and as you saw, it has 2 links and a name. So that is what we're going to do on the nav bar. Then from there, the majority of our time is going to be spent on this grid. So you can see we have 12 grid items here. So it's a 4x3 grid, or 3x4, depending on how you read it. So we're going to next build out the portfolio item grid. And that's going to use images, titles, and descriptions. And as you may have noticed, it also is going to implement animations. And so the way we're going to accomplish that is by using JavaScript. So this is where we're going to implement JavaScript. Now we also, as you can see, have another page. So this is our About page here. So we're going to also build out the About page. And that is just going to have an image. It's going to have a split column layout. And then from there, it just has some content. Okay, so as you can see right here, these are 4 steps to building the website. And if you were coming to me as a client and asking me to build this site, the very first thing that I would do when I was handed a design or I knew what I needed to go build is exactly what I just walked through. I would walk through the basic steps here because, as you may have noticed, this gives me a little bit of a to-do list. So it's not incredibly detailed. You couldn't just go take this and start building it, but it gives me a structure because I've discovered that if I am just handed a project and I try to go build it, then I'm going to procrastinate on it and I'm not going to be very efficient. But if I have a clearly defined structure for what I need to do, then it makes it so I can break that task into a bunch of smaller tasks and then I can go and build the system. So this is what we are going to do. So let's start off with the very first one, which is to build the project. And the way we can do that is I'm just going to open up the Windows Explorer here, and I'm going to put this in the desktop. So here I'm going to go and say new folder, and you can call this application whatever you want. I'm just going to call it Portfolio HTML Site, and that's it. Now what we can do in Sublime or in VS Code and Sublime Text and some of those others, it's going to be similar. You go up to File and then go to Open Folder. And then from there, you can see on the desktop, I just click on this folder. And what that's going to do is it's going to open it up as a project. So this is going to have everything that we need. And so here I'm going to give our very first step. So here I'm going to add the index.html file. Now, if you're in one of the other code editors, then you can usually just right click where you want to place that, and then you want to call this index.html. And now with this file open, what you can do is start actually typing HTML code in here. Now I have a little user snippet, and what a user snippet is if you've never used it before, is it gives you the ability to store snippets of code, so blocks of code, and then you can call them whenever you want, so you don't always have to type it in manually. And so I have created this little HTML one, and so if I click that, then it gives me this entire little set of code items. Now, not all of this is necessary for what we need, so I'm going to get rid of the ones that aren't needed. and then you are going to be able to, if you do not have any user snippets on your system, then you can just pause the video right now and type this out. This is a basic HTML skeleton. So this has the doc type, and if you ever see code that looks like this, where it says doc type HTML, that tells you that this is a HTML5 website. Then you have head tags, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and then body. Now this body, this is where we are going to place the majority of our code for the home page. So let's test this out just to make sure that it's all working. So I'm going to use what's called a heading tag. So I'm going to type in H1, and then inside of this tag, I'm just going to say, hi there. Now I'm going to hit save. And assuming everything works, then what I can do is just come here and then click Control-O, or if you're on Mac, Command-O, and then go and find wherever you save that file. So here it's the portfolio directory and index, and if I open it up, you can see it says hi there. So everything there is working properly. So I'm going to, and also you can see this gives you the path to the file right up here. I'm going to copy this and then go back here. You don't need to do that part, but I want to have the finished version and what we're working on open at the same time, so that way we can continually go back and check to make sure that everything that we're doing is lining up with the final version. So that is the first part of it. Now that is only going to get us so far though, obviously. I'm gonna get rid of that heading tag. And now let's go up, and if you remember, some other points that were needed were that we need to have the ability to have other files. So this is gonna be index, but we also want to have that about page, if you remember that. So I'm going to say new file about HTML. And so now inside of here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add that HTML snippet here, and I will get rid of the ones that aren't needed. And then inside of here, I'll just say about me. And then let's add a heading here, and now let's do a H2, which means it's going to be very similar to the first heading we saw. It's just going to be a little bit smaller. And I'll just say about me coming soon. Eventually we'll add more to this. And now if you switch over to the browser, hit open again, now you can see we have this other file. If I open it up, says about me coming soon, but it's a little bit smaller. So that's kind of what a heading tag represents. So this no longer has anything because we got rid of that H1. So that is the majority of our structure. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to add some styles. So as you may have noticed, we have a lot of styles going on here. We have all kinds of things that help with alignment, with colors, with sizing images. That's all done by CSS. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a CSS file that our entire application is going to be able to use. So let's go back to our home page, and I'm also going to close out of the about because we're not going to use that one for a while. And now in the body, I am going to just have another placeholder here. This time I'm going to say dot, and then from there let's just say placeholder, because it doesn't really matter. We'll get rid of this in a second, and say I'm in a div. Now, what a div does is it gives you the ability to place components on the page. So even if you're in VS Code and you hover over it, even gives you a little summary of what a div is. What a div is it's an HTML element that allows you to properly manage all of the elements on the page. So if you want to put some content or an image or anything like that in a specific spot on your site, then placing it in a div gives you the ability to not only organize the code, but also to select it. you're going to be seeing a lot of what I call and what is called selecting as we go through this course. So right here I say I'm in a div, and I said this has a class of placeholder. When we say we have a class, this means that this gives us the ability to now select this placeholder. So in other words, it gives us kind of like a benchmark or a target on the page that we can go and we can say, okay, I want to go and I want to grab this value. So, and I gave you the cool little shortcut where you could say placeholder like that, but in case you're not using a text editor that allows for that, you can just type all that out manually. So you can say div class equals, and then we'll say another class here. And here I'll say I'm in another class. So now let's hit save, and I'm going to refresh this. You can see where it says I'm in a div, and now it says I'm in another class. So both of those are there, but if you right click and click on inspect, what you'll see now is you actually see the code. And this is the browser developer tools. So Chrome has this, Firefox has it, pretty much all of them have it. I personally prefer what Chrome offers, but this gives you the ability to take a look at the code, and as you're going to see, it also gives you the ability to test out styles, which is very helpful. There are many times when I'm building out websites that I'll spend quite a bit of time just adding styles and working through the developer tools here before I go back and actually apply the changes. Now, if you do make any of those changes here, just know these are not permanent whatsoever. So for example, if you went to google.com here, you can right click on this button, so that little Google search button right here, and you see where it has a bunch of height items where it says, okay, height is 36 pixels. Well, you can say, well, what would it look like if that wasn't the case? Or what would it look like if this was actually 236 pixels? Now, you may right here, if you've never done any kind of web development or whatever, you may think that I just changed Google's code. That is not accurate whatsoever. This is only the code that was sent to the browser. So whenever we went to google.com, that server sent us the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code. When it's here in the browser, we can do anything we want with it, but that doesn't change it for anybody else. So this is simply the browser developer tools allowing you to make changes. And so that's something that as you start building out websites, you'll discover is quite handy. So what I want to do, the whole reason why I'm adding these little placeholder items here, is I want to add some CSS styles and I want to make sure they're working. So let's now switch back to the code. And I'm going to come to index and I'm going to type out link, and then you also can obviously type this out manually. I'm simply doing this to save time. And so from here, I'm going to say styles.css. Hit save. And so now what we have to do is create this file here. So I'm going to come here and create a new file. Make sure that this is typed exactly the same way. So if you say style instead of styles, then it's not going to know where to find it. So I'm going to say styles, and so this is going to give me a new file here. And now what I can do is I can use CSS to select elements on the page and then make changes to those styles. So let's test this out. The way that you can select an item, if it is a class, so right here, you can see that we have two classes where it's a class with placeholder, a class of another class. The way you select it is with a period and then the name. So I'm going to say dot placeholder. And now what I can do is let's just test it out by saying background color is red. And then now let's come here And let's pick out our another class, and this is case sensitive. So if I did something like another class, this would not work. And so now what I can do is let's add something else. So this is going to be light sea green as the background color. So now if I come back here and hit refresh, you can see that that has applied the styles. So what has gone on right here, and you can see it's placed inside of the developer tools as well. So what's gone on is the CSS file was added, and you can click on head here and you can see that now we have this styles CSS file. Inside of that file we have a couple selectors. One found that there was a class named placeholder, and then it said, for that placeholder element on the page, I want you to apply a background color of red. Then it found a style rule that said, if you find a class called another class, then I want you to make the background color on that light sea green. And that's exactly what it did. So we now know, because of that, we now know that that is working and our architecture is all set up. Now, just in case you're curious on what would happen if you say you had the wrong file name, so I just changed that to style. Now hit refresh, and those styles are gone. Now in the head, it still has this call, but now it's pointing to a file that doesn't exist. So that was the whole reason why I added those placeholder items here, even though we're not going to use them, is because without them, then we wouldn't be able to be 100% certain that the styles were getting applied properly. And now the final item that we need to have all of our architecture done is to add the images. You may have noticed, if you go and look at the final version here, you may have noticed that we have these 12 images. Well, those don't come out of thin air, so I'm going to add those directly into our project. So let me open up the Explorer here. And inside of the project directory, I'm going to just copy over from over here. I'm just going to copy an image directory. Now in the show notes, I'm going to give you access to the images so you can just come and download those yourself so that you'll be able to follow along, or you can use your own images. And just in case if you're curious on how I got all of these are all free to use. And if you go to unsplash.com, this is a great resource for being able to search for any kind of images, and they're all free to use. So you could type in coding, and there are all kinds of cool coding pictures that you can use for your own project. So that's definitely a good resource if you're building out websites for others. So let's come back here, and now we have everything working. Now you can see we have the images directory. This is going to have all of those portfolio images, and then it's also going to have all of the logos. Now obviously if you're building this out for your own portfolio, then you're most likely going to want to have your own images and your own logos. These are just projects I personally have worked on, so I'm including these for myself, and eventually I think I will probably take portions of this portfolio and add it to my own application, my own personal portfolio, so I can use that. So those are all the files that we are going to need. So we have our first item on our checklist completely crossed off. We have our files and our architecture all set up. So now with all of that in place, let's move on to the next one, which is the nav bar. So I'm going to get rid of everything here, and I'm going to start building out that nav bar. And before I do anything when I'm building out these kinds of front ends, I first just like to have the content there, because once I have the content, then I can rearrange it. I can see what I actually want to use, and then I can also see how all of the code needs to be arranged. So I know that I have the two links. If you remember, we have the two links, and we can go and verify that here. So we have these two links, and then we have this little just kind of a name. This could be a logo or anything, but for right now I'm just going to have it be text. So I'm just going to add first those things. So I'm going to create a link, and the way you can do that is by giving a href and inside of an a tag. Now, if that sounds like a foreign language, do not worry. An a tag is how you define a hyperlink in HTML, and href is where the link points to. So right now it's going to be index.html, and I'm just going to say home. Now let's copy that and let's point to our about file, and then here we can just say about, and that's all we need to do. Now let's switch back and let's test this out just to make sure it's working. So there you go. You can see we have home and about. Now if I click on about, you can see it takes us to the about page. So in the very beginning intro, I told you we were going to talk about routing. That is as easy as routing gets in HTML. You really just have to point to the file that you want to reference, and then it'll automatically go there. So if I click home, then it takes me right back to where we were. It takes me to that index page. Now, if you wanted to point to an outside website, so say you wanted to say, I want you to go to Google, then you could just create a link, and instead of just passing the file name, you would pass the full reference. So this is called the absolute path. So you'd pass that, and so now if you click on Google, now it'll actually take you there. So that's how you can work with links, and also how you can implement routing in HTML. So we have our home and our about, and then we just want to have a name here. So I'm going to put this inside of a div, and there I'm just gonna give my name. I'll do it in all caps because that's what the designer said to go with. Hit save, and now if I come back here, you can see it has my name. So yeah, this doesn't look anywhere near as good as this one, but that's where the CSS comes in. And so if you've never worked with HTML and CSS, just know that HTML by itself is going to look exactly like this. There's really no style to pure HTML. That's what you need CSS for. So believe it or not, with just the code that we have right here, we're going to be able to create this nav bar, but it's going to take a little bit of work. So let's get started on that, because I told you we were going to be able to get this website done in an hour. So we're going to have to get rocking and rolling here. Okay, very first thing, whenever I'm building out a site that I'm adding some structure to, is I create a container class. So this gives me the ability to manage the entire set of elements on the page. So I'm going to create a container class here, and then I'm going to close off this div at the very end. So if you had not noticed yet, every div needs to have a closing div. So right here you can see that this is the start of the div, but anything that has a start needs to have a finish, just like we have. That's why I added this div here at the bottom. If you forget to add a closing div somewhere in the code, you are going to have some very weird styles. So that's why, even though we have a lot of code to add above this, where all of our portfolio items and everything are going to go, you still want to make sure you always are adding your closing divs, or else you're going to run into some very hard to debug kind of issues. So we have this container class, and that's where our entire application is going to go. Now the nav, though, needs to have its own div. So here I'm going to create another class here, and I'm going to call this nav-wrapper. Now you can call these anything you want. These are just the type of names I personally use when I'm building out applications. So I'm going to, once again, I want to put all of those nav items there. So we need to make sure that we are adding the closing div in the right spot. And then I also am going to, I always indent this, and that is the best practice. So don't have all of your code lined up without any indentation. if you have elements that are nested inside a parent div like we have right here, then you want to make sure that those are indented. So one thing you may notice if you go back and you look at the page right now, nothing's changed. And the reason for that is divs by themselves don't really do much. The only thing that they do is they will give a line break, which is the reason why this name here is on a line below. But adding these wrapper divs didn't do anything. The only thing that's going to add some different style there is when we go into our CSS file. So that is going to be our nav wrapper. And then inside of here, whenever you're looking at a page and you're looking at a design you need to build, right here you can see that we have our links on the left-hand side, but then on the right-hand side, we have the logo or the site name, that kind of thing. Whenever I see something like this, my first thought is, okay, how am I going to arrange this in code? And usually the most logical approach is to create divs that these groupings belong into. So in other words, I'm going to create a left column div, and then I'm going to create a right column div. So let's wrap our home and about inside of those. So here I'm going to say left, and I'll just say left side. And then right here, I'll close that div off and then indent it. And then I'm going to just copy this. And on this one, it's going to be right side. And then indent that. Once again, this won't have any changes on the site, but what we're doing here is we are wrapping the code up in a way where it's going to make it much more straightforward to select these elements on the page and then add our own custom styles to them. So we are almost there, except I just have a couple more classes that we want to add. So these links shouldn't be all by themselves either. These links also need to be in their own wrapper class. So here I'm going to create a class called nav-link wrapper. Notice this is different than nav wrapper. This is nav link wrapper. So it's specific to that. And then I'm just going to close that div off and put that inside of it. And then I'm going to use the exact same div here, or this, I should say, the same class here. And then down below, this one's going to be a little bit different. Now I'm going to create a different class name because if you notice, we have different styles here. These links have a different look and feel slightly than this brand. So these styles are going to be related to links. These styles are going to be related to text. So I'm just going to call this brand. Close that off, indent it, and that is the full structure that we're going to use for our nav bar in HTML. So now that we have that, I think that our page is definitely at the spot where it needs some styles because this is starting to look pretty ugly. So now let's make some magic happen with the styles. So I'm going to come here and let's get rid of all of that code. And now I'm going to start with the nav wrapper. I'm going to start pretty much top to bottom. So you can see here we have the nav wrapper up at the top. And then from there, we move down to left side, nav link wrapper, right side, and brand. So we're going to add styles to each of those. And that's going to give us a perfect opportunity to learn about Flexbox. Flexbox is a tool inside of CSS that allows us to align our elements on the page in a much more straightforward manner than it used to be possible. So let's start off by getting that nav wrapper. So I'm going to say nav-wrapper. And then inside of here, I'm going to say display, colon, and then flex. So what that is going to do is let's go really quick to here and see exactly what we have going on. So now you can see something kind of interesting. You notice how by just adding that one style rule it moved the name, that brand class, to the right-hand side. So the way that Flexbox works is it takes your wrapper divs, and so if you come here, so you can see with nav wrapper, notice here how inside of it, even though you see a lot of code here, technically there are only two divs. We only have our left side and our right side. Now inside of left side we have multiple divs, but the way Flexbox looks at things, it completely ignores everything inside of the child elements. So what we can do is we can say, I want you to apply flex styles to nav wrapper, which means that just by default it is no longer going to have the elements stacking on top of each other. Instead, they're going to be on next to each other, like left side and right side, exactly like how we have right here. So now that we have that in place, we can start to add some other styles. So here I'm going to say justify content and then space between. Now this is going to do something pretty cool. It's actually going to do pretty much exactly what it says. It is going to justify the content, and the way it's going to justify it is by spacing it out using all of the open space in between. So now if you come and hit refresh, you can see that it took all the open space and it's now using that for justifying that div. So that is pretty cool. Now let's come and let's also add some padding. And so for this padding, I'm going to go with 38 pixels. I'll hit save. And what that's going to do, what padding does, and you can see in our little box right here, you can see the diagram for how padding works. It has margin in the far end of the box, then it has whatever your border is, then it has padding, and everything inside of that is your actual content. So when I said I want you to take what is right here and I want you to add 38 pixels to it, right now it has 0 pixels. So this is going to increase this by quite a bit, and if I hit refresh, you can see that now we have space where we didn't before. So that is the full set of styles for the nav wrapper. Now let's go and add styles to that left side class. And here we're going to say display flex, because as you may have noticed right here, these two items are sitting on top of each other, but in the final version, we want to have them right next to each other. So display flex allows us to do that. So if you now hit refresh, you can see they are right next to each other. So we've seen how we can select single items, but now let's see how we can actually traverse down a tree. So I'm going to just copy this. I'm going to start with our nav wrapper, and then I'm going to use the greater than sign. So I'm going to say I want you to start with the nav wrapper class. I want you to select that, but I want you to apply these styles to it. Next, I want you to go down to the left side, and then I want you to grab the divs inside of there. So how that's going to work in the HTML is it's going to look at the nav wrapper, then it's going to go down to the left side, then it's going to grab any divs inside of there, and whatever styles I'm about to give are going to be placed on those divs. So that is the way you can traverse a tree in CSS. So you grab each one of those objects and tell it exactly which one you want to work with. So here I'm going to add some margin right. So I'm going to say 20 pixels because you saw how they were right next to each other. And then I'm going to do a font size of 0.9 M. This is the way M works is it's a percent of what it normally would be. So by default, the font size is 1 M. So I'm going to say 0.9, which means about 90%. So now if we come back, hit refresh, you can see that now we have this nice spacing and the font size is there. Now you may have noticed that right here with the brand that I have it in all caps, and here we have all caps for home, about, and the brand. Well, I did that on purpose. I wanted to show you that you don't have to actually type the code out in the HTML in all caps. You can use CSS to do that as well. So if you want, you could put in what's called a text transform and then say uppercase. Now you have some other options too. You could see when I did that, you had a few other ones. I think downcase was one, and there were a few other options, but uppercase is what we want here. Now if I hit refresh, you can see that that automatically converted these so that they were in their uppercase state. And we use CSS to do it. The HTML itself was not changed. This still says home, about, and it's in its normal case. So that is that. It's our left side. Now inside of the left side we have that little nav link wrapper. So let's add some styles there. So I'm going to say dot nav link wrapper. I am going to add a height. So this is going to be a height of 22 pixels. Then I'm going to do something that may look a little weird, but I'm going to explain it here in a second. I'm going to add a border bottom here that is of 1 pixel, solid, but then it's transparent. So in other words, you're not actually going to see it. And the reason for that is going to be made apparent here in a minute. And then we're going to also see how animations work in CSS. So I'm going to add a transition. And this transition is going to call whatever part we want to add the animation to. So I want to animate the border. So I'm going to say transition, border, bottom. And then here I'll say for this one 0.5s, which means half a second. Now nothing's going to happen here yet. So if I hit refresh, all that's really going to change are the style elements. What we're doing is we're setting up the styles so that they can have this kind of behavior. They can have that cool little fade in, the colors can change, there's no jumping, anything like that. So this is what we're looking for instead of what we have there right now. So now that we have our nav link wrapper, let's come down and let's start adding some more class styles. So now I'm going to say nav, and let me just copy this. So nav link wrapper, but now at the end I'm going to say a space and then an A. So what we're doing here is we're saying inside of the nav link wrapper, I just want you to grab the A link. Now we didn't have to go through all of this kind of syntax, just mainly because we're just using a single selector. We're just saying I want the nav link wrapper with the A link. And so now inside of here, I want to add a little bit different color. So here the color I'm going to add is start with a hash and then say 8A, just like that. And so that's giving us kind of a light gray. And then also, if you may have noticed right here, this underline looks kind of ugly. This is the basic HTML underline. And you may have noticed here, we have this cool little underline that is spaced out. The way that you can accomplish this is actually by telling HTML to not have an underline at all, and then we're going to use the bottom border attribute in order to manage that style. So what I want to do here is I want to say text decoration none, and then here I'm going to say transition color, and then I'm going to say same thing, 0.5 seconds. So half a second here. So what we're doing is we're setting it up so that we can have two animations, because we want to animate the color. We also want to animate that border bottom. So now if we hit refresh, the only difference is the underline's gone, and then we also have changed the color. So we know everything's working, but we still have to implement the rest of those styles. Okay, and switching back, believe it or not, we only actually have 2 more style definitions to add in order to finish the nav bar. So I'm going to say here we want to now have our hover states. So as you may have noticed, if you look at the final version, this set of styles changes based on the hover action. So in CSS, you have the ability to tell the browser when the hover state occurs, I want you to change the styles. So I'm going to say nav link wrapper and then add a colon and hover. That's a way that you tell CSS that you want to use one of these. They're called pseudo states. So we want to check for when hover occurs. And when that happens, this is where we're going to change that border bottom. So now I'm going to say border bottom 1 pixel solid, and then we can just say black. Hit save. And now let's just come here and do the same thing, except it's not going to be the border bottom. It's actually going to be the color. So here, and it's not going to be on the wrapper itself. And I'm going to explain why in a second. So I'm going to say nav link wrapper A, and then inside of it, color, and then black. So this may look a little bit tricky because technically you may have noticed we have 2 different hover states, one for the link, one for the div itself. But I'm going to show you why that is here. So if I hit refresh, now you can see that's working perfectly. You notice how we have the cool little animation, and we also have it fading in and out as opposed to what we had before, where it was just that ugly text decoration. So this is matching up perfectly. Now, if you notice also these fonts are different, the reason for that is because we haven't imported the font we're going to go with at the end. So right now this is just the ugly basic HTML font. Eventually we're going to add in our own custom one. But that is working perfectly. So great job if you've gotten to this point. You now know how to build out a full nav bar using Flexbox. So now that that is crossed off the list, let's move down and start building out the portfolio item. So this is going to be what takes up the majority of the screen real estate. So this is going to obviously be an important part of it. So we'll come back here and I'm going to switch back, and I'm actually going to come to the very top. Part of the reason why I didn't do this in the beginning is because it really wasn't the right time for it. But at the very top, I'm going to put my kind of master styles here. So I'm going to select the entire body. What this is going to do is it's going to grab the body of the HTML document, and I want to add a margin of 0 pixels. So what that's going to do is by default, the body has a margin of, I believe it's 8 pixels. And so in order to get rid of that, we have to override that. So now if you come back, hit refresh, you don't see a huge difference because the background's white, but this did remove that margin. You could kind of see those move back a little bit. So that's why we're removing it, because if you notice, we want these images here, the portfolio item images, butting up against the side of the page. So we need that. Now we also are now going to be introduced to CSS Grid. So CSS Grid has a lot of similarities to Flexbox. It is a tool built in directly into CSS, and it gives you the ability to align items. Now there are a number of differences between the two. We definitely don't have time to go into all the differences. Hopefully, as you see as I'm building this out, some of those differences will be made apparent. My kind of rule of thumb is I like to have my layouts in Grid, and I like to build out my small elements like my nav bars using Flexbox. That's my personal preference. Everyone is a little bit different. But we are going to lay out our entire application using Grid. And so that is where we're going to grab that container class that we created. And now I'm going to say display grid, and I'm going to say grid template columns 1 FR. Now that may look weird if you've never seen that before. What we're doing is we're saying, I want the container to use grid, and then I want you to create these template columns using 1FR, which stands for fractional unit. So what that means is that our entire layout now is going to be considered as having columns, even though you can't really see them. If I come here, one of the nice things about Google Chrome and Firefox, if you hover over, do you see those little dotted lines there? That's telling us that that is one of the columns. So just like how Flexbox was able to take those div elements and separate them out, Grid does the same thing. And when you say 1FR, that means 100%. It means I want you to take up one fractional unit, which means this column of the nav bar should go from end to end, just like our portfolio items should go from end to end. So that's how that works. So now everything that we add below here is going to be considered in that next row down below it. So that's all the styles that we actually need to add to our container class. And so now let's move all the way down. And so now what we're going to do is be able to start building out all of the portfolio styles. So I'm going to just kind of give us, and this is just kind of a best practice. Here I'm going to add some comments. So I'm going to say master styles. And then here I'll say these are our nav styles. And then if you come all the way down to the bottom, these are going to be our portfolio styles. Hit save, and now what we can do is actually jump back into the index now that we know where those styles are going to go. And now we can go right, notice where nav wrapper, notice where it has its closing tag. Now what we can do is come and we can do the exact same thing we did with our HTML on the top nav bar. Now we can do that for the portfolios. So I'm going to create a wrapper here. So I'm going to say content wrapper. And then inside of here, I'm going to create another wrapper called portfolio items wrapper. Now, one thing to keep in mind, it's very important that you keep your naming consistent. So here, all of the portfolio items are going to go inside of it. I'm also going to have this in a singular form. So here I'm going to create, let me give us a little more room so we can see it. And let me close this div off. So let's indent it, and here notice the difference. We have our content wrapper, which is just everything on the page. So everything below the nav bar is going to be in that content wrapper. Then the portfolio items wrapper. This is going to give us the ability to have one spot we can go to where we know this is what stores the collection of portfolio items. Then down below that, we're going to have the portfolio item wrapper, just like this. So we're having our kind of our master one here. This is our master wrapper. Then we have the collection wrapper, and then here we have the single one. So if it helps you to visualize how it works, if you look at the finished version, the entire page, everything below the nav, is inside a content wrapper. Inside of that is the items wrapper that has all of them. And then each one of these, so like this Quip one, this DevCamp one, those are each their own singular wrapper. Now let me give us some more space so we don't go too far off the screen. And so now inside of here, what I want to do is actually build out what one of these is going to look like. So I'm going to just say div. I'm going to write this one all out, and I'll show you why here in a second. So I'm going to say div class portfolio dash img dash background. Now, obviously, you can call these whatever you want, but I like my names to be very readable. And this tells me that this div is going to have a portfolio image background. Now I'm going to add a inline style. So this inline style is going to be a little snippet of CSS. So this is going to have a little bit of CSS code. So I'm going to say background dash image colon URL, and then inside of here, I'm going to pass in parentheses, and the parentheses is going to be a path to the image I want to grab. So here I'm going to say images slash portfolio1.jpg, and that's it. And then from there, I have to close that off, and then it automatically closed the div for me. So let's hit save here, and let's just make sure that this is making it onto the page and we don't have any URL issues. So if I hit refresh here, it's not going to show up because we haven't given it a height yet, but let's make sure it's in the HTML. So I'm going to click on content wrapper, items wrapper, item, and then you can see we have this background image right here, and it is pointing to the portfolio JPEG. It appears that everything there is working. So if you're curious on why that didn't show up, it's because we're going to do a little trick. If you notice what we have here, where we have this code that is layered on top of the image, and we have this cool little animation and this fading, that is something that HTML and CSS right out of the box really does not do. So we need to have a way of implementing that kind of style. So the way I did it was creating a div, and its only job is to have a image and to have that image as its background. Now we're going to have the text in a completely separate div, and so let's add that part now. So I'm going to come here and make sure you're outside of that portfolio item wrapper, or I'm sorry, the portfolio image background. And now let's create another div here, and this one I'm just going to say image dash text wrapper. And here I'm going to have one div that is going to manage the logo. So I'll just call that logo wrapper. And then inside of here, I'm going to have the image. Now, you're going to see two ways of working with images with HTML and CSS. The first is when you want a background image, then you use straight CSS code, just like we have right here, with a call to the URL of wherever it's at. Now, if you're using images inside of your HTML, then you want to use what is called the img tag, and then you pass in src, which is short for source, and then you pass in the path. So for my first one, it was images slash logos slash quip.png, and make sure you don't have any spelling mistakes or anything like that, or else it will not find that. And so that is going to be the logo wrapper, and then below that is going to be the subtitle. So here I'm just going to call it subtitle, and you can add whatever you want in there. Now, I personally, because these are all my own actual portfolio projects, I'm just going to go off screen really quick, and let me copy that. So I'll hit save, and now we should actually have that. So let's switch over here, hit refresh, and now you can see that that's working. Now the image itself is white, so you can't see it on this white background, but now you can see that it's at least there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to I'm going to pause the video right now, and I'm going to copy and paste all of these. And I don't think that it doesn't really serve you any purpose to watch me do that. So what I'm going to do, just so you know, so you can follow along, is I'm going to take the singular portfolio item wrapper. I'm just going to go and I'm just going to copy until its closing div tag. So I'm just going to do this 12 times, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to call the appropriate logos. Now for you, it doesn't matter whatsoever which one you use, and I'm also going to increment this value. So I'm going to do portfolio 1, 2, 3, etc., and update the subtitle. So I'm going to pause the video, do that so that we have all 12 of them on the page when I come back. And we're back. So all I did, like I mentioned, was I just duplicated each one of those portfolio item wrapper classes and everything inside of them. And then I just updated the logo name and the subtitle, but none of this matters because this is specific to my personal portfolio. Yours is going to be different. So you can really have just copied the identical one 12 times. So now that we have that, and you can just go verify here that that's working. So you can see that has each one of the items there now. Now we can start adding the styles. So at the very bottom here on portfolio styles, I'm going to take the portfolio items wrapper. Now make sure that you spell it correctly. It's portfolio items, plural, wrapper. And then inside of here, we're going to use CSS grid once again. So I'm going to say display grid. And then from here, this is going to be a little different. We don't want each one of them to take up from the full left side to the right side. So I'm going to say grid template columns, which is what we used before. But now I'm going to say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So what this means is it's going to give each one of the columns, and it's going to have 3 of them. So we're going to have 3 columns here, and it's going to give each one of them their own little full-sized column. So now let's hit refresh. And now you can see that it's moved them so they're all in their own columns. Obviously still a lot of work to do, but notice how easy that was. Within 2 lines of code, we were able to create an entire grid layout. I can tell you as someone who's been doing this for a very long time that it used to be much more challenging than that. So that is something that I really enjoy using now, is tools like CSS Grid and Flexbox. So now with that in place, let's go and let's grab the portfolio item wrapper. And here we're just going to add a position to it. So I'm going to say position relative. And what that is going to do is it's going to allow us to have some more flexibility with how we position each one of the items inside of it. So I already mentioned how behavior like this, where you have text and images sitting on top of other images, by default HTML and CSS don't really allow for that kind of thing. So we're going to have to kind of force that to happen. And so the first step in that is by adding a position relative. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start styling that image background. So now I'll say portfolio-img-background. And this is going to style the cover and just some of those image related items. So we first want to have a height and a width. So the height is going to be 300 pixels and the width is just going to be 100%. So that means that each one of those is going to be 350 pixels tall and the width is going to adjust automatically. Then I want to have a background size of cover. So what that's going to do is imagine a scenario where you don't have images that are the same size, which is actually the scenario we're in. Each one of those is sized differently. We want to make sure that we are cropping the images so that they will all sit nicely next to each other. And so that's what background size cover does. Then I want to do background-position, and then I'll say center. And then lastly, background repeat, and we want to do no repeat. So this is the reason why I set a background image on each one of those elements and why I used inline style. So instead of us putting the images here, I did it right here. And so now all of our styles are going to apply to that background. So now if I come back, hit refresh, you can see we are starting to get somewhere. So you can see that now we have our background image and we're starting to actually have something that looks a little bit closer to what we have here. So we are on our way. Now we still have some work to do. We now need to work with that text. So notice how that text was just sitting down below it, and that is the default behavior. Remember, whenever you have HTML and you have two divs sitting next to each other or below each other in the code, HTML is just going to say, okay, inside that div, you just slide on right underneath, and then it's going to continue on. We want to say, nope, I want to position the HTML right on top of this other div. And so the way we can do that is first by selecting it. So I'm going to say image text wrapper, and inside of it, I'm going to say position absolute. Then, and also one key thing to note here, because this can be a little tricky if you've never done it before, position relative is required for if you want to have any position absolute elements nested inside of it. So that's why we had to add that position relative here, because if we're going to use position absolute, which is us saying we are forcing this element to be someplace where usually it would not go. In order to do that, it has to be in a parent element that has a relative position. So I'm going to say top 0, which means I want this to be positioned at the very top. And then I also now want to use Flexbox. So I'm going to say display flex. And now I'm going to say flex direction. We'll use column. Justify content. We're not going to use space between like we did before. Now we're going to say center. Then inside of there, we're going to say align items, center. We'll give it a height of 100%. We'll say text align is going to be centered. And then we'll add some padding. So we'll say padding left is going to be 100 pixels, and then padding right is going to also be 100 pixels. Wow, that was a lot of stuff. So let's actually take a look at this, and then definitely feel free to review each one of these items. But essentially what we're doing is we're saying that this image text wrapper is going to be positioned at the very top wherever we want. Then inside of it, all the elements are going to use Flexbox. So we're going to center these items. We're going to use Flex. We're going to center them from left to right and top to bottom. That's what align items does. And so justify content is going to do left to right. Align items is top to bottom. We want it to take up the full parent height, so that whole 100%. And then we want all the text inside of it to be centered. So now if we hit refresh, oh yes, this is starting to look better. So now notice that this is starting to finally actually look a little bit more like this. So we have our images, and now because we've used absolute styles and positioning, now we have those images and text sitting on top of that background image. Okay, we are getting much closer to being done. So now let's come back to the code and let's style those images. So now I'm going to grab and when I say style the image, I mean the logo image that's sitting on top of it. So I'm going to say logo wrapper, I believe that's what we called it. And here I'll give it a width of 50% and then a margin bottom of, not block in, just margin bottom of 20 pixels. Hit save, and now if we come back and hit refresh, oh, it looks like I forgot to actually select the image. Logo wrapper image, like that. And now if I come back, there we go. So notice how much better it looks when they're a little bit more shrunken down like that. No, they're also now all unified, so now they have the same exact size. So this is starting to get really close. Now you may notice that we're about to get into the part where we're adding that dark fade animation, and the subtitle doesn't actually start off. So we need to make the subtitle be invisible in the beginning and then animate it, change its color, and then have it appear later on. So let's see where we're at right now. Right now it's black, and so what we're going to want to do is let's go first, and let's first make sure we have these colors and the style right for the subtitle, and then we'll talk about how we can use JavaScript to animate that. So let's come here, and the style, let me really quick come back to the index to see what we called that. So that is just called subtitle. So here I'm going to say subtitle, and then inside of the subtitle we're going to want the font weight. So this is how we can make things bold. I'm going to say font weight is 600, and then the color, let's go with that light sea green. Hit refresh, and that's looking a lot better. Now it's not matching perfectly because we haven't added the custom font yet, but that is what we're wanting from a style perspective. And then we're also going to have to darken these as well. So let's see what else we need to do. And one other thing, one little change I'm going to make. So technically this works, but we are going to have to, I'm going to add a little temporary note here. So I'm going to say needs to be more specific with selector. Because remember, this is going to change based on if someone's hovering over it or not. And so I just want to make a little note there just so I don't forget when I come back to it. So now let's talk about how we can have those images get darkened. So I'm going to create a class here called img darken. And we know we want to animate it. So I'll say transition, and we'll just say 1 second. And then I'm also going to use what is called a filter. So I'm going to say filter, and then we'll go with brightness, and brightness is at, let's go 10%. Okay, this is not going to do anything yet because we have not applied this. We haven't called it in any of the index HTML file. But what this will do, or how we're going to use it, is we're going to kind of use this as our own special function. So we're going to have our JavaScript dynamically add and remove this class when someone is hovering over that. So that's going to be pretty cool. That's going to allow us to have a lot of flexibility with how we can do it, because if you tried to do this without JavaScript, then it's going to be a very tricky kind of feature to implement on the CSS side. It is possible, but it's not the way I would suggest. So I will always go with just a little sprinkling of JavaScript if you want to implement a feature like this. So now let's come up here and let's add that specificity. So here we know this is the ending version. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say .img text wrapper, and then we're going to add it. So we're going to say only for that hover state, then this is what we want to occur. So I'm going to hit save there, and now if I hit refresh, then this only turns green and changes when I'm hovering over it. So that's working pretty well. Now let's come up and let's add the start state for it. So technically that should only happen when someone is hovering. So now let's remove this hover value and let's add the transition. So I'll add transition, 1 second. I want it to be nice and slow. And then I want the starting color to be transparent. So I'll hit save here, and now if you hit refresh, you can see that it's not there, but when you hover over, you can see that that's when it appears. So let's see, and I'm seeing you see that little jump? So I'm thinking that in order to fix that, I think what I need to do is to have the font weight also there as well. So if I save that and hit refresh, there we go. You see how much smoother that is? And the reason for that is because the font weight was starting here and it was starting at its normal value. So we were catching and we were able to see that little transition from normal all the way to the font weight of 600. So that was the fix there. And now technically that is all of the styles that we need. So we still have some for the about page, just a few, but those are all the styles. So now let's hop over and let's add the JavaScript code. Now, JavaScript code, typically where you're going to see it is at the very, very bottom of the page. And the reason for that is because JavaScript works with selectors, very similar to the way that CSS does, but you would not want your JavaScript code to run before the entire page is loaded. So we're going to actually go under the body tag here, and that's where we're going to add our JavaScript code. And the way that you can tell HTML that you want to run JavaScript is by creating a script tag, just like this. Make sure you have a closing and opening one, and then just like that. And now we're going to select the portfolio items. So we're going to grab all of the portfolio items on the page. Now, if you've never done this before, don't worry, it is not like magic whatsoever. We can just come here, and if you come into the console, you're going to be able to see how we can do that. So I'm going to just build out a little selector here. So I'm going to say $, and then inside of make sure you use an apostrophe, and then say dot portfolio item wrapper, and then you can see that it pulls in that portfolio item wrapper. It pulls in the very first one that it finds. So that means that that is working properly. You can do a selector. Now this syntax right here is actually what the browsers allow you to do in order to work with JavaScript code. Now JavaScript has a little bit different syntax, but I wanted to do that first one just so you could see what you can do inside of the browser. Now what we want to do is to store it in a variable. So the way you can do that, and if you are not familiar with JavaScript, you've never touched it before, do not worry. You can just simply follow along and see the process. So I'm going to say const portfolio items. What this means is I'm creating a variable called portfolio items. And now I can say document dot query selector all. So I'm saying that I want you to find all of the elements on the page that have that selector. So we can even come here and just copy this, because we already know this works. So paste that in here. And now if I run that, nothing gets returned. But if I click on portfolio items, we have this really nice little node list. And you see how it says 12? That means that it selected all 12 of these blocks here. So that means it's working, and if you want to click and expand it, you can see it grabbed each one of those portfolio item wrappers, and we have access to everything, including a very important element, which is to add an event listener. So the same way that we listen to the hover state in CSS, we can do that in JavaScript. Except with JavaScript, you have to be a little bit more explicit. So I just copied that code here. So that is exactly what we already entered into the browser. So we know that works. And now I'm going to loop over these. So I'm going to add an event listener. So I'll say portfolio items dot for each, and for each takes a function. So what a function is, if you've never worked with JavaScript functions, is it's just a process that runs. And so we're saying we want you to run this process for each one of the portfolio items. We need to be explicit and say we want you to work with all of them. Now, when I say portfolio item just like this, I'm giving what's called a iterator variable. Now, this may look really weird if you've never seen it before, but this is not a special name. I could say X right here, or I, but I wouldn't recommend it, mainly because if you did, you wouldn't really know what you're talking about. But I like being explicit with the name. So I'm going to say portfolio item, then you do the equals greater than symbol. So that's called an arrow function in JavaScript, followed by curly braces. And so now everything inside of here, every time that the page loads, is going to be run. And it's going to be run and applied on those portfolio items. So now I can say, I can grab one of the singular ones. So as it's iterating, every time it goes through for each, it grabs that element and then we can do whatever we want with it. So now I can say portfolio item and then dot add event listener. So just like we added our hover state, here we don't call it hover though. The way JavaScript goes about it is it's called the mouse over event. And mouse over event also takes a function. So we're going to use our fun little arrow syntax again. So very similar to the same syntax we had here. The only difference is for the for each loop, we passed in an argument. This portfolio item is called a iterator variable, but it's in the item slot. Here, we didn't have any arguments, so we're just running what's called an anonymous function. So we're saying just go and run this process. So here I'm going to do this, and let's just log it out. So I'm going to say console.log, and then let's grab the element. So I'll say portfolio item, and let's just see what we have when we do this. So I'm going to hit save. Clear this out with clear console. Now hit refresh. Now if you hover over there, do you notice now how you have access, and it is now every time you hover over one of the images, it's doing exactly what we wanted. So it is logging this value out. So the very last one that we should hover on should be this one. So now if I click on this, this tells me exactly what's there. So it gives me access to all the elements inside of it. It gives me the portfolio image background, the image text wrapper, everything like that. So that is perfect. That's exactly what we need. Because if you remember, the entire reason we're doing this is because we want, whenever someone hovers in, we want to add that class that we created. That, I forget the name of it, you have to reference it, the image darken class, I think. Yeah, so we want to add that. And so now that we have access to it, we can. So let's come back here. I'm going to get rid of the console log statement. And actually, you know what? Let me keep it up there for 1 second so you can see this, because as you may have noticed, this gives us a lot of data. It gives us the full div, but we only want one of the items here. So that part might be a little bit trickier if you've never done this before. So I don't want this next part I'm going to do to kind of intimidate you whatsoever. It is probably the most challenging part of this entire tutorial. So if it looks weird to you or anything like that, don't worry. It is all we're doing is we're taking that HTML object of that div and those classes, and we're using JavaScript to manipulate it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say portfolio item dot, which is what we just console logged, dot child nodes. So what that means is, if you remember, we had those child nodes, which means those nested divs. We had those nodes come out. So if I want to, I can just say console log here, and let's see how this works. Okay, so if I hit refresh now you can see we have this node list. So this looks a lot like an array. It's a collection, and we have these indices here. So the first one is just text. We don't want that one. So what we want is to grab that element, the portfolio item background. It had an index of 1. So what I can do here is, let me just get rid of this. I'm going to say portfolio item dot child nodes. I want to grab that one with the index of 1, and then I want the class list. So I'm going to say class list. Okay, and this will be the last console log we do in a while, I promise. But the other thing I did promise you at the very beginning of this tutorial is I'd walk through my exact process, and this is exactly what I would do. So if I were asked to build this kind of thing out, I would walk through all of these steps where I would console log constantly, I would run the debugger like this, and I would be able to see all the values that are there, because as long as I know the values, I will not get stuck. I've been doing this for a long time, and one of the biggest challenges that I've found is when I don't know enough about the data, that is when I run into bugs. So I try to always make sure that I'm listening to the data and what it's telling me. So let's come to the console here. Now if we hover over, you can see we have this DOM token list. Now we have that portfolio image background, and we have the value of it. So notice how we've kind of traversed this entire element. We first started off with grabbing all of them. Then we narrowed it down. We filtered it down until we got the exact div we wanted. And then from there, we filtered it down even more. And we said, you know what, just give me the class list. And so now that we have all of that, let's actually just take all of that. I'll keep that console log just in case we want to see anything else. Now I'm going to say class list dot add. And now this is where we finally get to call that image darken class. So here I can say image darken. And so now let's hit refresh. And look at that. Now that is working. Now when we're hovering over these, it is actually making that happen. So that is fantastic. Now you may notice that it's acting a little tricky because, why? Because these images are staying dark. Well, that is because we need to add one more event listener. So I'm just going to copy this and come here. And this time, instead of adding event listener mouse over, I'm going to say mouse out, just like that. And I'm going to remove all these console log statements. And now instead of class list add, I'm going to say remove. Hit save. Now if you come back here, hit refresh. Now you can see that when you mouse out, now it is doing exactly what we're looking to do, that it fades in, goes out as you're navigating all around the page. So this is working beautifully. Very nice job if you went through that, because now you not only know how to work with animations and all kinds of styles like that and to create your layouts, you also now know how to traverse the entire DOM, all of these HTML nodes here, and to apply dynamic styles based on the user behavior. So very good job with that. We only have one very small piece left and we're going to be done. Let's switch over to the About page. And now let's jump into the text editor and we're going to actually build this out. Now, as you may have noticed, we have a lot of content here, and with the way that just vanilla HTML CSS sites work is, in order to get this on the other page, we're actually going to have to copy and paste this. Now, if you are working on a larger application that uses a framework such as Ruby on Rails or React or Vue or something like that, then what you'll see is that you don't have to copy and paste this. You simply will have one shared layout or multiple layouts for the application, and then you will dynamically update the content inside of it. So this isn't something you'd have to do if you're working with a framework, but because we're not, we do have to do this. So I'm going to first come here and I'm just going to clear all this out, because if not, then we would run the risk of having two versions of HTML in there, which would be a little tricky. So now let's just copy and paste this, and then we'll remove everything we don't need, which is the majority of it. So here we'll change the title to About, and we still want the style reference, and we want the nav, the home, the about, and all that kind of good stuff. And then we also want to have the container. So that container was there at the top, and we want the content wrapper. So we want that. I'm going to get rid of everything else for the portfolio items wrapper. We don't want that, and we don't need that JavaScript. So I'll delete that. hit save, and now we are good to go. So let's come back here, hit refresh, and you can see that this is working. We have the home and about links. Now we have this nav bar, and we can start adding what we need in this page. So this is our last element. So inside of here, I'm going to create a class, and I'm going to call this one something a little more generic, because if you're building this out for an application that may have all kinds of pages, then you don't want to do something like call this the About Us page or something, because then it'd be weird if you wanted a 2-column layout for your contact page or something. So here I'm going to say 2-column wrapper, just like this. And then inside of here, I want to have the profile image. And let's take a look at this just so I don't forget anything. So we want to have the profile image here, and then on the right hand side we want to have that content. So we want to have then one class, then we'll just call this profile image wrapper. And then inside of here, we're going to have an image, but I'm going to wait on adding that until I've added the full structure. And then, so right below profile image wrapper, let's have the dot profile content wrapper. And that's where we're going to add the content. And for the sake of this, obviously you're going to have your own content that you'll put in there. But for mine, I'll just copy mine over. So we have a image. If you look through the image directory, and if you go all the way down the bottom, you see we have this profile image. So we can call that. So I'll say image, and the source is going to be images profile.jpg. You don't need an alt tag for this. And now inside of here, we're going to have our one heading and 2 paragraph tags. Now we haven't dealt with paragraph tags yet, but what they do is pretty self-explanatory. They just give you paragraphs. They're a way of segmenting different pieces of content. We did see an H1 tag before, so that one is going to be relatively familiar. I'm just going to copy this over, and then inside of here, I'll just paste all of this in. And let's give us a little bit more room. Feeling a little scrunched here. So I'll say H1, and then make sure that you close off your H1 tag. And now with the paragraph, it's the same thing. So you're going to have a paragraph, make sure you close it off, and then place that code inside of it. At the very end, close off that paragraph tag, and then we'll do the same thing here. Okay, so now if I hit save, let's go and see what we're dealing with now. So if I hit refresh, you can see, okay, kind of, but not really. So we have the image, but it's taking up a lot of space. And this is the size of the image. This is the actual size that we have. And then we have this below it. So this obviously needs a few styles. So let's go and add those. I'm going to come down here at the very bottom, and we're going to add in a comment. This is going to say the about page styles. So now what we can do is let's add in the styles for that 2-column wrapper first. So 2-column wrapper. This is going to use grid. So we're going to say display grid. And then inside of there, we're going to have 2 columns. So grid template columns. And you may have guessed that means we're going to do 1FR and 1FR. Now we have that profile image wrapper. So with that one, what we're going to do is profile-image wrapper. We need to make sure we're grabbing the image, and then inside of here, just say that we want the width to be 100%. Let's see what this is looking like now. So now if I hit refresh, there we go. That's looking much better. I'll close this off, and you can see that's giving us much more of the behavior we're looking for. Now we just need to add a few styles here. So let's do that. So we have that profile content wrapper, and then for that, I'm just going to add some padding. So padding of 30 pixels. And then let's style that H1. So profile, content wrapper, H1. And then the color of this one will be the light sea green. Hit save, refresh, and there you go. So that is phenomenal. This entire site is looking so good. I'm really liking this. Now, the one thing that's missing is the font. So that font really needs to get better. So the way that a great spot to find fonts is at fonts.google.com. So I'm going to have the one I already picked out, which is called Lotto, but you can use any one that you want. And the way you can grab it is click that little plus button, and it's going to say you have this family selected here, and it's all free to use. So it gives you the code that you need to use right here, which is very nice and handy. So I'm going to grab this link, and inside of both of these, you need to put it in the top of index and the about, and you need to use it above the style sheet. Is to paste that in. Same thing here, come up to the top, paste that in, and so now we actually have access to it. So if you come to styles and go all the way to the top of the page, inside of the body here, what you want to do is now you have the font, but you still need to call the font. And so inside of the body, because we want everything in the application to use it, I'm going to say font family, and then we'll say Lotto, comma, sans serif. What this means is that we're telling our CSS that we want you to use Lotto by default, but if you can't access it, and that could happen. So imagine that this URL that's sending us the font is too slow, then we're saying that we want to have a backup font right there of sans serif. So let's come here, hit refresh now. And there we go. Now we actually are looking like a real site. So notice how much difference the right kind of typeface just makes a huge, huge difference. So that's looking really good. Come here, click on About, and this is working beautifully as well. Now there's one thing I just noticed that I forgot to put in, it'll only take a second to do, is that you notice how we don't have an active state on these links. So if you come here on the final version, when you're on the About page, it has the underline permanently there. When you come to Home, it's there. Right now, we're only getting that when it is a hover state. So what we need to do is to add that active state in. So I'm going to come here, come into nav styles. Let's come to just to the very bottom of these nav styles, and I'm going to create a new class here called active-nav-link, and we're going to add the border bottom of 1 pixel solid black, which we've already been using before. And then we also need to do the same thing, not with the border, but with the color for the link. So active nav link with an A. And now we can say color and then black. And then we have to do one other thing. We have to say this is important. And the reason for that is because we need to override the default color behavior. And so this should be all we need to do that. Okay, that is going to be part of it. Now we actually have to call it from the HTML. So whenever we're on the home page right here, then what we want is that active nav link to be there. And whenever we're on the About page, we want it here. So here it's going to be active nav link. Okay, let's see if that finishes us off. So hit refresh, and there you go. Now you can see this one's active. If I click on home, now the home one is active. And that's how you can add active states and an active class directly to that. Now you could use JavaScript to do that, but that would take even longer. So this is kind of a quick and easy way of doing it. just fantastic job if you went through this. I know that was a very long time, but you literally within just around an hour or so, I know it ended up being a little bit more than that, but just in a pretty short period of time, you built out a fully professional website. You have now all kinds of cool things like animations, you're using images, you have multiple pages, you're using modern technologies such as Flexbox, CSS Grid, so that you're laying these components out on the page properly, and you are ready to go. You can, with these tools, you can build any kind of website. And that's really one of my top goals for this video, is giving you that, because I can tell you, I build web applications literally all day. And so I am using these kinds of tools constantly. What I just showed you makes up the majority of the HTML and CSS code that I'm writing on a day-to-day basis. Being able to center items, being able to lay them out on the page so that they're all in the spots where they need to be, applying styles, using selectors. Those are the kinds of things that you'll be doing every day as a developer. So great job. Congratulations. You have your first website done and you're ready to move on and build out any other site that you can think of.